Father, I want to thank you so much for being able to gather together today and be reminded of these truths. We just sang a song about being redeemed, about the old man being dead and gone, about this new change that welcomes us home. That kind of change is celebrated whenever we gather together. I think how awesome it is to be able to gather together and everybody singing from the same page. There's not very many places that we can go to in our current day where you feel that sense of community when in our best moments we're encouraging people to live life worthy of this calling that we receive in Jesus. So I pray that you would just continue to use the rest of the service towards that end, that we leave that much more motivated to give you glory in all that we do. And we'll be careful to give you all the praise in Jesus' name. Amen. There was a man who was in a hot air balloon, and he had come to the awareness that he didn't know where he was and was completely disoriented. And so he looked down this open field and saw some people, and he began to descend. And as he got closer, he began to call out until finally he got one of the men's attention. And he looked up and he says, "Look, I'm lost. I don't know where I am. And I made a promise to a friend that I'd meet him in about an hour, but I really didn't even know how to get there." He says, can you help me? And the guy looked up at him, and what he told him was, he says, "Look, you're 30 feet off the ground." He says, "You're between 40 and 41 degrees north latitude and between 59 and 60 degrees west longitude." And the guy looked down at him and said, "You must be an engineer." And the guy said, "Yeah, I am." He goes, "How'd you know?" He goes, "Well, everything you told me is technically correct, but I have no idea what to make of your information. And the fact is that I'm still lost, and frankly, you've not been much help at all. If anything, you've actually delayed my trip." To which the guy looked up and said, "You must be in management." And he says, "I am. Why do you say that?" He says, "Well, you don't know where you are, and you don't know where you're going. You've risen to where you are due to a large quantity of hot air. You made a promise you have no idea how to keep, and you expect people beneath you to solve your problems. And the fact is, you're in exactly the same position you were in before we met, but now somehow it's my fault." You ever feel like that guy in that balloon? You're kind of adrift, you lost your bearings, you're just looking for some really good direction. I don't think there's a place in our life where that is more pronounced than when it comes to the discipline of dealing with our assets, with stewardship and giving. We have a way sometimes to becoming so overwhelmed that the quality of life that we're leading can oftentimes be that much more complicated. And you see that in household after household. And so as we've been engaging now in this study of essential disciplines, we want to talk about this discipline of giving and stewardship. And it's really hard. You know why? Because it's not so much that you need to know God's plan, because God is not silent. God has given us a lot of direction in this area. In fact, you realize that God has more to say about how we handle our resources than he does about heaven? That's true. If you look at all the verses in the Bible, it talks more about our stewardship than it does about heaven. But here's the thing, it's not enough just to know what the right things to do are. You have to be able to put them into practice. It's about execution. Because just knowing the right thing isn't enough. And then the problem is even that much more exacerbated, because how easy is it to look in a mirror and define what your faults are? And then how easy is it to make a plan to change them? In your more lucid moments, you sit there and you can see with some clarity and you're thinking, "Oh, man, why do I do that all the time? I know better." And then the weakness of this flesh just comes in, and the next thing you know, man, we're just still walking in a way that we know we shouldn't. So when it comes to stewardship and giving, there are some principles here that if we lay hold of them, there is a passage, and I'm going to read it for you later, but it says, you will take hold of the life that is truly life. And that's the promise I want to make you today. As we go through this, we're going to look at a couple of things. We're going to look at a number of principles. So over the next 4 weeks, I'm just going to enumerate one of those principles. So today, we're going to look at principle 1. And then along that line, if we get that principle, you've heard people talk about climbing this ladder of success, right? Well, I want us to climb God's stewardship ladder and to make some really good places to achieve this life that is truly life. There are a number of things, a number of these steps that we have to take. So once we get a hold of this principle and this step over the next 4 weeks, I trust that it would really just transform the way in which we are living our lives. So towards that end, I want us to turn to a passage that's found in the Gospel of Luke and chapter 16. It's a story about the dishonest steward. So verse 1 says, Jesus, in speaking to his disciples, said this. He says, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. And so he called him in and asked him, what is this that I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. If you've ever been called on the spot, brought into your employer's office and given that kind of speech, you know what's coming, right? You're going to lose your job. So this guy's in crisis mode right now. He's just been told that he hasn't been doing a good job. In fact, he's been told more than that. In the story, we're told that he is to be the manager of the rich man's possessions. So whose possessions are they? They're the rich man's. He's doing a poor job, such a poor job that his reputation has already preceded him. People have been talking, and that's what he says, it has come to his attention, right? This is what I'm hearing about you. So it's nothing that he just did once or twice. This is now a pattern of behavior. And so consequently, he's like, what am I going to do? Well, notice what it says here in verse 3. It says, the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So in this moment where he begins to do this personal assessment and recognizes, yeah, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg, what am I going to do? And then all of a sudden this little light goes on and says, if my quality of life is to remain, I'm going to have to do something pretty drastic. So in order to maintain this good life, he comes up with a plan. He has a strategy. And what is it? Verse 5 says, he calls in each of his master's debtors, and he asks the first, how much do you owe my master? And he replied, 800 gallons of olive oil. So the manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 400. Then he asked the second, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat. He says, all right, sit down, make that 800. So he comes up with a strategy, and now he starts to execute on that strategy. Only, doesn't it strike you as something really odd? He's basically ripping off the owner. Notice what it says in verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. Jesus is telling this story to those religious leaders of his day. They had been arguing about the way in which he was engaging tax collectors and sinners, and Jesus tells them the story, right, about the lost coin, lost sheep, the lost son. Just showing something about the heart of God. And then he takes this now another step, and in the very next chapter tells them this story about being a good steward. But it comes up with a little bit of a twist, doesn't it? The dishonest manager is commended. But let's make certain that we really understand the story. Jesus has already said that this guy is a dishonest manager, right? And if he's a dishonest manager, then that places him squarely then in the category of the people of this world as opposed to the people of the light. So now when you look at this story, I want you to start thinking of categories. Whatever is happening in this dishonest manager's life and the way in which he is conducting his business, you need to see that he is acting shrewdly, right? He's acting with intent, but he's doing so as one who is part of the people of this world, dealing with worldly wealth, as opposed to how we are to be dealing with worldly wealth as people of the light. And that's where the problem is then. See, the problem that we're going to be looking at in this story is that Jesus is saying, okay, you expect this guy here, if he's going to try to live the good life, he's going to do whatever it takes to make sure that he is in a favorable position. Right? We ever work with people like that? It's all about them, right? It's all about, hey, it's like the golden rule. Whoever has the gold rules. Right? Do unto others before they do it unto you. Yeah, it's just taking these things and just twisting them around. So Jesus then is telling this story because he wants us to answer this question. And the question is this: how are Christians to manage their resources? He gives you an example of the unjust steward, and now he's going to turn around and use that in a way to demonstrate how we as believers ought to be managing resources. Because if you want to live the good life, just like that dishonest manager wanted to live the good life, then you're going to have to be as shrewd as he is, only you have to maintain certain understanding of what your job is supposed to be. So I'm going to give you 3 things now that will, land the plane on one big principle. The first is we have to learn to manage God's resources with an eternal perspective. Now, why do I say that? Well, let's follow the story. Look at verse 9. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. So somehow or another, we're going to be told now that as you use worldly wealth, you ought to use it with the perspective that one day you want to be welcomed into eternal dwellings. This worldly wealth, then, is something that we are managing. Well, what did we say the dishonest manager was doing? Wasn't he managing the wealth of the owner? You realize now then, as you have been on the receiving end of talent, of treasure, skills, abilities that you have, even the air that you're breathing in this moment, it's all a gift that God has given to you. All that you have belongs to him. To underscore that, when this life is over, are you going to take it with you? When this life is over, there's no more managing of this worldly wealth. You can't take it with you. That bumper sticker that says, he who dies with the most toys wins, that's not true. The one who dies with the most toys is still dead. So here when it says that you have to manage this worldly wealth, you got to recognize that one of the things that we're being asked to do then is to manage whatever it is that God has placed before us in a way that pleases him. Because if we do that, you're going to live the life that is truly life. This one guy was doing everything he can just to make sure that he had this favorable outcome. But it was in this world. Jesus is telling the story to everyone to make sure that they live in this world, managing the wealth of this world in a way that prepares them for the world that is to come. Because when this is over, you're going to stand before God and give an account for your life. And many times we can go through life and we don't even think about it. We're just living. But there's coming a day when you're going to stand before God and give an account. So you have to live in a way that has this eternal perspective every day. But notice what he says here, you have to gain friends for yourselves. The dishonest manager said, when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their homes. Why? Because now they're indebted to him. He just kind of reduced their debt. But it says now, as a believer, you ought to gain friends for yourselves so that you would be welcomed into eternal dwellings. What does it mean to gain friends for yourselves? Is it just, trying to gain the allegiance of other people? So it really is just about you. So it's just, I'm just going to do nice things for them so that they're going to do nice things for me. See, I don't think that that's what's being said, and I'll show you. There's a text from 1 Timothy chapter 6. And in this whole idea of gaining friends now and using wealth, look at this. Look at what Paul writes to Timothy here. He says, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth." If you have resources, can it place you in a position where you kind of think sometimes maybe you're a little bit better than this other guy? Just because you have more stuff? Makes you a little bit more arrogant, a little bit more entitled. It also says that if you have enough stuff, that's where you put your hope. Because having enough stuff sometimes keeps you above the fray. But in all honesty, all you need is a couple of things to go sideways, and then you're in the same position as some other people. I can't tell you how many times I've sat across, chairs where some people who they were living really large, man, and then all of a sudden, the company went sideways, and this big salary went out the window. And now they're older, and they can't find that same job anymore in that same industry. And what happened to all of that arrogance? What happened to all of that hope? Rather, it says here, you ought to put your hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. If you had a view of God that sometimes feels like God is here to simply, give you a hard time, notice what the text says. God says he's giving you everything for your enjoyment. God wants you to have this life that is truly life. He's given you things so that you can embrace it. This isn't a sermon to make people feel guilty about what they have. This is a sermon to just say, are you managing the stuff that you have well? Because if you do, it's going to have eternal consequence. So that's why you go back to this text, and it says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. You notice it says when it's gone? It doesn't say if it's gone. It doesn't say, in the event that something happens. It just says straight up, when it's gone. It's a fact. It's short-lived. So what it's saying is now is the opportunity then to use our resources in a way that honors God. And what way does that the best? Remember we said here about gaining friends? Those of you who maybe might be familiar with the story that Jesus told about separating the sheep and the goats. You remember what the basis was for the separation? He says he went to them and he said, when I was hungry, you gave me food to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick and in prison, you visited me. And those who did, they were separated on the side of the sheep, and those who did not were separated on the side of the goats. But here's the kicker in that story. Jesus turns around and the group that were doing it, they said, Lord, when did we see you sick? Or when did we see you hungry or thirsty and give you something to drink? And Jesus said this, whenever you have done it to the least of these, you have done it unto me. So when you go out and make friends for yourselves, it's because you're motivated to love people as you love yourself, because you love God. If I love God, then I'm looking at people as those who were made in the image of God. And I get it. Some people, that's kind of marred. You got to look a little closer to see it. But the truth of the matter is God's saying, no, I want you to love people the way I love them. Because if you do, then you're going to be welcomed into eternal dwellings. See, that dishonest manager, he was just going to get into somebody's temporal house. Might be a nice house, might be a good way to spend the few years that you have in this life, but when it's over, it is over. You want to be welcomed into eternal dwellings, and who has that? God. And so if you want to be welcomed into eternal dwellings, then you better be doing God's things God's way, because you're managing his stuff, not your own. All right? So you have to manage with an eternal perspective. Second thing here is that you have to manage God's resources as a faithful steward. Look at verse 10. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? You see this little much thing? People will say to me, well, I could be generous if I made more money. This text is saying, no, you won't. Yeah, if I won the lottery, I'd be really generous. I'd take care of a lot of people. No, you probably would just give out of the abundance. You really wouldn't give. Because Jesus is saying something about the heart of mankind. He's saying, look, if you can't be faithful in a little bit, then what makes you think you're going to be faithful with a lot? And the only person that can answer that question is you. Wherever you fall on this continuum, with whatever little you have, are you faithful with that? Are you demonstrating a capacity of generosity and giving? Or is it just about you? Like that dishonest manager. His life it's all about making it better for me. God's saying, no, you're a child of the light. You're to love your neighbor as yourself because you love me. But it goes on, right? It's not just about the little much analogy. There's also something here where he says, if you're not faithful with worldly riches, who's going to give you true riches? Here's the thing that for me, I was just like, oh. In this text, you could have the best investment portfolio out. It's earning great returns for you. When you're dead, you get any more of that? Can't take it with you. You realize, though, that an investment in kingdom priorities means that you lay for yourself a foundation in heaven where moth and rust cannot destroy and thieves cannot break in and steal? It's saying that when you're welcomed into heaven, it will be this firm foundation waiting for you. So if you invest in kingdom work, God's saying you are investing in your future. And that is being recorded. So I wonder, again, because I want to make this personal, right? At the end of the day, you leave this earth and now you're standing before God. What does your bank account in heaven look like? Now, don't make this about amount, because God says that the woman who gave 2 coins, right? The widow's mite. She gave more than everybody who's throwing in a ton, because she gave out of her poverty, not just her abundance. But I'm asking you, if you look at your checkbook, you look at the way in which you're investing your time, look at your calendar, how much would you say is going towards this kingdom investment? And don't underestimate that, because Jesus is saying in this text that as you gain friends, as you do the work that I'm asking you to do, you are ensuring that you will have this eternal reception. It's not that you earn your way into heaven, it's demonstrating that you took this seriously. So you have to manage this work as a good steward. And one other thing while we're at it, if you look at this passage, right, it's, in the that's before us, he's saying, if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? Now, again, sometimes when we're doing this Bible reading, it's like happening fast, right? But I want you to just pause for a moment. Isn't that reversed? Isn't it usually said that if you can't be faithful with what you have, who's going to give you more, right? If you can't manage your own property, then why should somebody give you their property? In this text, it says, if you are not trustworthy in handling someone else's property, then you're never going to get property of your own. Because here's the point. The property that you're managing is God's stuff. It's his stuff. And if you can't manage his stuff, then what makes you think you're going to get your own stuff? Think about that for a moment. God is saying, look, I give you life, I give you talent, I give you opportunity. Think back on your own careers at how many times did it may have seemed like chance, but God opens up a door and suddenly you meet someone. I had a conversation a couple of days, about a week or so back with one of my boys. We're sitting down there and I'm trying to talk to him about, some things that I just noticed, and I felt like as his dad, I just wanted to speak into his life there for a moment. And he didn't appreciate it, but tough, I'm your father. So we sit down, and we're sitting, and I said, look, from my perspective, and you can give me yours, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking, and then you can tell me what you're thinking. And in a conversation, I told him, like, look, these are 3 things that I think that you ought to just be really focused on right now. And I said it in front of his wife because I know what happens. He gets one story and she gets the other story. I'm like, no, I'm not playing that game. So you guys are both going to hear this story. So I took him out for lunch. We're sitting around, had this conversation, and it went awesome. Didn't start off awesome, but it ended awesome. And it was just a really good time. I get on a plane, I come home. Within 3 days, 2 of those things are already taken care of. Because he just had some clarity, and he just realized, okay, man, I got to put up or shut up. I just got to do this. All he needed was somebody to just say, come on, dude, you're better than this. Get going. And he did it. As a faithful steward, God's saying, be faithful with the stuff that I have put in front of you. And I guarantee you that you will be added more stuff. Because you're showing yourself to be a good steward. But if you're not being a good steward, then why should God give you anything? In fact, very often, my experience has been that you always hit your head against the wall because you haven't learned the lesson. So the other side of this is, not only do I have to manage God's stuff in a way that shows that I have this eternal perspective and that I'm being faithful in the way in which I'm executing his will and purposes, not just mine. But let me go on one more, because at the end of this verse here, verse 13, listen to what it says. It says, no servant can serve 2 masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You see what I'm saying? It's all or nothing. You look at the text, it's saying life is that serious. God's saying you cannot serve as a pursuit money and at the same time have this great relationship with God. It's not to say that you can't enjoy your stuff. It's just that as a good steward, it gives you a different perspective on your stuff. Because this text is saying to you and me that if you're going to manage God's resources, then you have to do it with a singular devotion. So every day you wake up, you recognize I have been entrusted with this day. And this day comes with me exercising the authority and responsibilities that God has given me. If you have a family, as a parent. If you're a spouse, to my spouse, to my neighbor. I am now engaged in using all of the resources that God gives me so I can show to the world that I am a follower of Jesus. So that means my yes is yes and my no is no. It means that I live my life with integrity and I'm not having to backpedal on all the stupid decisions that I'm making or giving God, a black eye in the public arena. Because when we manage God's resources with eternity in mind, as faithful stewards and with a singular devotion, God is going to promise to bless not only the gift, but also the giver. And he will surpass our imaginations. So I want to just end this way. Bethany Church was established in 1727. That was a long time ago, right? And there are a few of the original members still here. But this building was erected in 2000. For this building to be erected, it meant that many people sacrificed. In 2011, we began services in Raymond. And that was after another campaign that raised resources of people and time and talent. And we took a church that was dead, and God breathed new life into it. And now, in 2018, we're doing the same thing to Kittery Point. Dwindled down to 4 people, and now I'm telling you, on the day we open that, is going to be standing room only. Why did you do that? Because we erected a lighthouse to remind ourselves and the community that God is still on the throne, that God is not dead. And even though we're surrounded by darkness, the light of the gospel of Jesus shines even brighter. And what has happened as a result of that? As a stewardship of resources that God has given to us and people investing back into kingdom work, I can tell you that thousands of men and women, young and senior, have deepened their faith in Jesus because of the work that is done under the umbrella of Bethany Church. Not because we're all so great, but we serve a great God and we serve a great gospel. And if you just manage God's stuff God's way, He's going to bless it many times over and over again. I can tell you this, tens of thousands of people in just the 15 years that I've been here have been exposed to the life-changing message of Jesus. They've heard this message and they've responded to that message, and it has changed and transformed their life, their families, their communities. And if time was given, many of you would be able to stand up and give a testimony about how your life has been dramatically changed. Your love for your wife or your kids has definitely deepened. You've been able to let go of these hurts for no other reason that Jesus says, look, with the forgiveness that I've given you, demonstrate that to someone else. I can tell you that through Bethany Church, through its work that is staffed and funded by you, God's stewards, we feed the hungry, we give drink to the thirsty, we invite the stranger in, we clothe the poor, we visit the sick, and by God's grace and God's power, we break the chains that envelop us. Just last week, Bob Whitted, who works in our missions group, was down in Shaw's. And he's walking around doing some shopping, and a woman taps him on the shoulder, and she has a little Shaw's button on. And he turns and looks at her, and she goes, you're one of the guys that works at Bethany Church, right? And he looks at her and says, yeah, I am. And she says, I just wanted to say thank you. And he looked at her and he said, for what? Well, we have this home here. It's called the Joshua House. And a number of weeks, people come who are in a program called a Seacoast Family Promise. And they're working through their homelessness. They have to take classes, and they're provided meals and accommodations as they're going through this program, because the whole idea is to take this family and get them out of this homeless cycle. We have about 70 people here at Bethany Church who will go over there and make meals for them, and they have to sleep over there. People taking turns doing all of this. And this lady taps him on the shoulder and says, I was one of those families, and I want you to know my daughter and I, we have a home now in Dover, and I have a full-time job here in Shaw's, and I just want to thank your church for doing what they did on our behalf. People who just use the resources that God has given them all along the way, it changes people's lives. Bethany Church, funded and staffed by the membership of Bethany Church. Those who come here, let me tell you something, we disciple the youth. Marriages, they're healed. They're strengthened. The grieving are comforted. The souls of men are fed, and the sinner is welcomed home. Talk about divorce care, grief share. Talk about any of these ministries that are around. They're open and available because people are motivated to give of their time and their talent and their treasure. And when people come, they're given resources so they can find hope. Because outside in this world, there's very few people that care about you. But if the love of Jesus is in you, how can you look at your brother and sister and just turn a blind eye? And if it's only because you're only concerned about you and your own, shame on you. You're not a good steward. Just look at the way in which you invest your money and your time, and then tell me if you're going to look at Jesus face to face and say, yo, I'm a good steward. Again, this isn't about guilt. This is just about biblical truth. You want to live the life that is truly life. Don't do it like the unjust steward. Do it as the one who is a faithful steward. You see, Bethany Church, it's not just the circles around us, but do you realize like Bethany Church has also, we give about $220,000 to $240,000 a year towards missions around the world. Just a handful of missions. Child Voice International, Conrad Mansiger, a member of the church in Raymond, started a ministry to bring hope and healing to young women who were ravaged by the wars in Uganda, sexually mistreated, forced to bear children that they didn't want, ostracized from their communities. Where are they going to go? And he built these communities now that they bring in all these young women and they teach them trades so that they could go out and make a full-time living. Why do you do that? Because you love your neighbor as yourself. Because you love God and you want to demonstrate that in tangible ways. Manna Ministries in India. Help for Haiti. You know how many children in orphanages that were just discarded are now being loved and cared for, prayed over, fed and housed, and given opportunity for education? One of the families in our own midst has been a big proponent of that, but the founder of that, he himself took one of the children that was dumped in a dumping ground. Somebody found her in a dump. And they brought her into her home, and now this woman is a registered nurse, and she's working and thriving. Who does that? People who realize that the resources that are laid before them weren't meant just for themselves. They were meant to show love for people above and beyond. It's not just about me. It's about me as a good steward of God's grace, going out there and making a difference in the world. I could tell you stories about Costa Rica, Bolivia, Haiti. I mean, we do a ton of stuff. And all because people are investing. So here's the principle. You want to live the life that is truly life? Then the principle is this: manage God's stuff well. Simple as that. That's the principle. The basic principle of asset management is to manage God's stuff well. And when that happens, you will take that first step on this stewardship ladder, because that first step is all about goods. It's about how you deal with that stuff. Are you just a consumer? It's all about me? Or am I a contributor? Am I demonstrating my stewardship of God's resources by the way in which I'm handling them that shows my love for Him and my love for neighbor? When you do that, you have a secure footing on that life that is truly life. Because if you forget that, if you don't manage God's stuff well, you just may miss out on the greatest journey. You're not going to go anywhere. But if you manage God's stuff well, He will bless not only the gift and the giver. And the work that we engage in, it will bear testimony for eternity. Let's pray. Father, I want to thank you so much for these reminders. It's hard, Lord. Sometimes we get so busy, and sometimes it's hard to just think about getting your own act together, never mind how am I going to engage the world around me. But it often starts with just little steps, just an awareness that you've entrusted me to be this ambassador of hope. If nothing else, it just puts a pause in my spirit to not think of myself more highly than I should. To make sure I'm finding some time in my day to just look at someone in the face and ask how they're doing. And when they respond in a way that just opens the door, it might be an opportunity for you to step in and show the kindness of Jesus. And when we multiply that many times over as a church, each doing a little part, the next thing you know, a building has erected and it is giving home to so many who have lost their way in this world. I do pray, Father, that you would just fan into flame this spirit of generosity, that we take it seriously every day, that you have called us as children of the light to manage your stuff well. And we'll be careful to give you all the praise in Jesus' name. Amen.